I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on our presentation on the basics of growing vegetables. And thank you to HSU for inviting us to participate with your program. My name's Sherida Phibbs, and I'm the Master Gardener Coordinator for Humboldt and Del Norte counties. I recently moved to Humboldt from San Joaquin County, and I'm thoroughly enjoying the beautiful country and, of course, the weather, because it's like over 100 degrees there right now, and the friendly people here in Humboldt and Del Norte. And I feel very blessed to be here. The UC Master Gardeners are volunteers, and we're trained and certified through the University of California's Cooperative Extension. We extend science-based educational services to our communities, making the focus on healthier plants, healthier environments, healthier gardeners, and of course that all ends up to being healthier communities. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to quickly address the questions that you might have during our presentations. They're on your toolbar is a chat or a message area. And please type in any of your questions that you might have. And at the end of the presentation, we'll address your questions. Our presenter today is UCCE Master Gardener Maria Krinick. And Maria brings many years of gardening experience to us, and she's been with the Humboldt Botanical Gardens since their inception, serving in several capacities, as well as participating in various gardening clubs and activities. Maria says she has a learning addiction that takes her in many directions and often at the same time. Her interest in gardens and gardening and plants and all of course, plant-loving people present her to many temptations to participate in a wide variety of activities. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Maria.
Well, thank you, Sherida. It's a pleasure to be here, and we've got a lot to learn, a lot to examine, and hopefully at the end of the lecture, we've at least brushed on most of the things that you need to do to get started. Ultimately, the best thing to do is to just get started. So we're going to have a range of topics, including climate and weather. We're going to talk about soil and sun exposure and the garden spaces and types and planning, your plant choices, taking care of your garden, some of the tricks of the trade, and of course, we're going to talk about the gardener as well. And at the end of it, we'll talk about some tips. Now we're going to start out with climate and weather. Our best resource is the USDA Cold Hardiness Zone Map, and that is a standardization of the areas around the United States. It basically tells us what the average minimum temperatures are. That helps us talk about how plants can be planted, when, where, and how. And with Del Norte and Humboldt, you can see as Master Gardeners for both counties, that's why we're examining these, they have the same kind of exposure that ranges from the inland areas to the coast in 4 typical temperature ranges from 10 to 15 degrees cold to 25 to 30 degrees here on the coast in terms of minimum temperatures. There's also another resource called the Sunset Zone Map, which is a little bit more detailed in terms of picking out 6 factors to work with: latitude, elevation, or ocean influence, the air influence, the mountains and the hills, and the local terrain. It generally covers the growing season from March to mid-November. It does talk about our Mediterranean climate, which basically means summer, drought, or no rain in the summer. And it also allows us to examine how we can use that information to decide on whether we're going to work with cool season plants, warm season vegetables, annuals and perennials, and other choices that we have to make. Now, the sunset zones range from the mountains of Humboldt and Del Norte over to the marine coastal influence that we have. And as you can see, we get into 6 different zones that help us understand and see where we are. Naturally, we're looking at our windows every day to check the weather. So remember, your weather day to day is very important for the decisions you make in gardening as well. When we're going into the next very important topic, we're talking about soil. Plants need soil to grow. And we're not going to talk about hydroponics and all those alternate things right now. That's a wealth of other time that we would need to deal with that. But let's talk about the soil. And the soil, like the climate and the weather, is variable. Even on my own property, I probably have 10 different areas that have 10 very distinctive types of soils. But soil is an ecological system that includes inorganic particles, or pieces of rock basically, organic matter, the living organisms that's their home, places for space for water and air and other things to gather. And then of course, all the superstructure like plant roots that infiltrate that. Soil is generally understood to be 45% mineral and inorganic substrate, 50% pore space, where air and water juggle for the space, and only about 5% is in organic matter. What that means is, and here it encapsulated, dirt is dead, but soil is alive with the nutrients that plants need to grow, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So yes, there's lots of different particles in dirt. They're positive and blue charged. Those charges create the energy for things to be moving around in soils. And what we find that are moving around are things like water and air, but also our nutrients, the macronutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the secondary nutrients of calcium and magnesium and sulfur. These 6 nutrients are the best reserve in the soil. And then there's a lot of trace things like boron, chlorine, copper, iron, magnesium, molybdenum, pardon my pronunciation, I always fall over that one, nickel and zinc. For a healthy soil to grow healthy plants, those have to be balanced appropriately, but they're all necessary for plants to be healthy. Soil is alive with organisms and organic matter. That's why plants can grow. They have to find the energy and the nutrients they need to grow. Those nutrients are made available by the activity of microbes, bacteria, mycorrhizae, on a more of a molecular level, but there's also earthworms that are churning it up and moving things around. So adding organic matter like leaves and old stems and things like that feed these organisms, which they in turn break those materials down and make them accessible for the plant. So basically aged manure, animal manures, green manures from plants, and homegrown compost are what you're going to be adding to your soil to make it work for you and the plants. We'll talk about compost in a little bit. The action and remains of earthworms and other insects add to that. And texture and aeration from this movement, from this activity, only enhance the water capacity and air capacity of the soils. So this decomposition is what makes this stuff available for plants. So plants do need nitrogen. Nitrogen is made available, like we were talking about, with all these the activities that goes on in the soil. So you need to add this organic material for those organisms to feed. And that is the best way to do it is with compost. So what is compost? Well, it's a bunch of plant material and things that have come together and decompose with this action. And it increases the health of the soil and the availability of these products to a plant. There's a special recipe that goes on with making compost, and that's all available on our website. It's a mixture that works well, certain proportions. It does ultimately improve texture, water holding capacity, and drainage and nutrients. And it makes an excellent mulch as well. So you can put it to top dress your plants. It feeds the plants, keeps the weeds out. But good compost smells good too. And you know you've done your job right if it smells and feels good. So here's some visuals on that. Remember, compost grows healthier plants, reduces your landfill because you're recycling those materials. It saves water because it conserves water in the soil, and it definitely improves all the quality of soil. And another graphic that tells you how you can use it around your plants, whether they're house plants or not, and use it as an organic fertilizer, directly applied. So let's go on now to deciding on the vegetable garden. Now, what do vegetables need for growing? They need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day. So find a place in your garden that has that amount of sun. With that amount of sun, you can grow most plants very well throughout the season. Orientation to maximize the exposure to the sun, rows running east to west. Remember, the sun goes across the sky east to west. And the tallest plants, avoiding tallest plants, shading younger plants, plant to the north side. Make sure you have a convenient water source. You don't want to lug buckets of water 100 yards to feed your lettuce, to water your lettuce. Choose the right place and the space to grow according to what you are going to grow size-wise. Make it easy to get to and harvest, and then protect your plants from foraging pets and visitors. So you're going to do some fencing. There's lots of types of vegetable gardens. Part of your ornamental landscape can have plants tucked into. You can have a movable garden in an old child's wagon. Raised beds are favored by me and many people because we can avoid being on our knees so much. Or you can do it in ground. It's been traditional for many, many millennia. So pick the right place where the soil is going to work with you. Gardeners can also choose the style that works for them. And that's where the gardener's decision-making happens to turn on themselves. Make sure your goals are in tune with what you can do. Take the time to plan. A lot of times we'll sit around winter months and dream about the garden we'll have for the next year, curled up with a warm cup of tea. Realistically evaluate the amount of time that you can give to your garden. If you're working full-time or more, you may only have a weekend garden. That decides certain things for you. So plan your garden size, your plant choices, and always think in terms of lessening the actual work and time you have to put in by doing things efficiently. Always evaluate the space, resources, and the investment you're planning to make. Pace yourself. Your stamina is more important to the success of your garden than you may realize. Start out small. You'll grow with experience and energy, and reap the benefits, not the cost. Make it as pretty as you want to be as well. Here's some examples of ways to help you make it easier on yourself. There's lots of things out there that might help you Be smart about it. Take care of yourself. You're in for the long haul. And get the right tools and work right. Figure out how your garden will give you the lightest amount of work. Research and evaluate the help you can use, whether you're talking about reeling hoses or digging dirt or moving things around. Raised beds for me minimize bending and keeps me off my knees. Irrigation systems can be very helpful, especially in a lifestyle where you're away a lot. Maybe you like to travel on the weekends, although traveling is a little limited right now. So find the right tools, the right size, the things that work for you, and then keep them in good working order. Sharper tools make light work. And then use your work time appropriately. Some of us do have more time to spare during the day for gardening. Others have to be a little bit more judicious about our time use. And then take care of yourself. Don't get the sunburn. Don't freeze your fingers. Don't get poked by the bushes and the things. Wear gloves. One of the things I do is I like to wear knitted gloves over plastic gloves or over other gloves to keep my hands warm. And then find the tools that work for you. It's all a matter of style. So another thing to do is plan and take notes. Be observant. It makes the job easier. Whether you're worried about rain amounts and frost dates or rotation of crops year to year, the varieties you liked or didn't like or worked or didn't work, those special notes all come in handy. If you're not a writer, if you're not a journaler, take a photograph and to tell you what happened and date it. Then decide. These are the decision-making times. Grow what you like to eat. Grow what grows well with all the other variables that you've already established. Then know what's available locally for you to help. Set up your garden space, put in your soil, dig in your compost, get it all ready, start the actual detailed planning of which vegetables you're going to plant, where, and how much, and then where and when you're going to get them started. So we've already gone through all this. You already know the climate, all these choices you make. Pick your plants and start planning. So what do? Where are the resources? Well, on our own website, we have things like vegetable planting guides that help you with deciding when to start your seeds, whether you're starting from in the ground or as transplants or as things that you're going to start in January and February. Some plants can be planted in successive waves. Others have definite times to plant and definite times to harvest. So we talk about their preferences too, whether warm or cold season, and perennial plants. Perennial vegetables are things like asparagus or artichokes that when you plant, they're going to be there 10 years, 25 years. So they need a special consideration and a permanent place. Consider that succession planting as we were talking about. Timing is everything. Plants need the appropriate time to grow. You have to start them at the time that gives them the most success. You can increase and do tricks and learn by extending your season, but start out small, learn, do, experiment, and then establish a 12-month gardening chart that helps you know what to do every month of the year. Here's an example of a planting chart for Crescent City. Now for coastal Humboldt County, this works very well. A little bit inland, you may have to adapt a little bit according to your frost dates, etc. But here's a list of average plants that are common. And notice that some of them are labeled with GH, that means greenhouse. So you know that you have to start them that early. You're going to have to take care of them and protect them. Transplants versus direct seeding, all these things are things that you'll have to be adaptable to. So just make your choices. Some of your choices also involve cool season versus warm season plants. So can we go back a slide?
Sure.
I'm sorry, Sherida. Cold season plants are the types that can handle a little bit colder temperatures and can get into the ground earlier. Warm season are not. They need warmer soils and warmer times. So great example of a warm season plant is the tomato plant. It needs to go into the ground after frost is no longer a problem. And with cool season plants, your broccolis, your peas, your lettuce can start a little bit earlier because they're a little bit more tolerant. Thank you. The seed packet, if you're going to start from seed, has a lot of information. Make sure that it's appropriate for your location because the instructions are generalized. But there is very important information that you can use on the envelope, so read it carefully. Plant only the seeds that you need, whether it's in the greenhouse or in the ground. Some seed packets are very generous in their quantities, so any unused seed, put in a jar in the refrigerator. Starting seeds indoors can be a very complicated affair if you like gadgets and things like that. But basically, they need certain conditions of light, moisture, and ventilation. You never use unsterile conditions for these guys because they're sensitive to begin with in terms of disease and fungal processes. And when your seeds are ready, please use a process called hardening off before planting. Planting depth is important because seeds are different sizes, shapes, etc. Fine seeds can be distributed more evenly if you stick them in a container with some sand or some similar substrate so that you can sprinkle them gently and get it spread out more evenly. Always plant seeds in moist soil. It's easier to have moist soil and plant a seed than it is to plant a seed and then try not to get it washed away when you go to water it. So gentle watering is always needed with seeds. When the seeds grow up, you've got transplants. They have to go into the garden at some point. Now, if you avoid these interior seed development, then buy your transplants from a reputable source where your materials are going, your plants are going to be healthy and clean and ready to go. So pre-water any transplant before you put them in the ground, and always make sure they're hardened off. Now, transplants that you grow from nurseries and things are usually already hardened off. They've already been exposed. But your own transplants, it's a 10-day process. You begin by putting your new transplant or new seedling, young seedling, outside in increasing time periods until about day 7, at which point you can stick it out overnight for planting a couple of days later. It helps them acclimatize. Some plants, some quote transplants, are bare root plants, and perennials and other things that are like onion sets and garlic and potatoes. They're not really seeds and they're not really transplants, but they do require the same health in terms of being successful and moisture and appropriate planting methods. So let's talk about care. And under care, we're talking about water. Watering is one of the most important. Protection from adverse exposures, especially when they're young. The sunlight they're getting, pest and disease control, nutrition, and weeding, staking, and pruning. So let's start with watering. As we discussed, always make sure that you've watered your seeds and transplants very well. Consistent, proper watering is successful to vegetable gardens. Check your soil moisture regularly before watering. You don't want to overwater as much as you don't want to underwater. Water stress issues with plants encourages pest, disease, and waste resources. It is dependent on season, soil type, and crop. Vegetables are not drought tolerant. They need that consistent moisture. You can help that along by planting vegetables with similar needs together. And the goal is to do proper watering, the entire root zone, and make sure you know where the water is going. And the best time to water overhead is early in the day. And use and avoid splashing soil on plants. That encourages diseases. Now, again, depending on the crop, every other day, 5 days, twice a day, depends on the crop and your conditions. Your transplants and seeds are the most vulnerable, so please be aware of them on a daily basis. Hot, windy weather, more water. Rain, maybe you can skip a day or two, right? 1 to 2 inches of soil is dry, means you need to get to the watering. Consider irrigation system and timers for efficiency, for traveling time, for less work. And also consider water conservation by the use of mulches. One of the things that is difficult sometimes to gauge is how much water you need to put, because it's dependent on soil types. Some soils grab water and hold it a lot better. Others, like sandy soils, it drains right through. So knowing your soil really helps you with your watering. So one way to test that is to squeeze a bit of your soil in your hand and see what happens. With sandy soil, it stays crumbly. With soil that has a mixed texture, it'll clump up a little bit, but not as much. The extreme, of course, is sand versus clay. And as you can see in the picture there ahead of you, that clay is really clay. And you know why our prehistoric ancestors were able to figure out how to make pots. But the clay loam is a mixture of these particles. And here's a very graphic example of what happens with water traveling through a sandy loam and a clay loam, both reasonably decent soils to work with. You might want to plant heavier feeding plants in your clay soil, the plants like tomatoes and things like that, and your sandy loam might be better off with the shallower rooted plants, because that's the other dimension. Some plants are more shallowly, more confined root zones. And so knowing what your plant's roots are like will help you also in considering water. So now we're talking about nutrition. Water and nutrition are 2 of the most important things you need to deal with your plants. Renewing your garden's fertility is a constant activity. Nitrogen, which is the biggest need for plants, is short-lived, and it has to be renewed constantly. For leafy vegetables, their needs are greater than things that produce fruit. So it all varies with crop and soil type. Another reason to bunch similar plants together. Manures of any use, whether horse, goat, chicken, whatever, have to be very well composted. Most of the bad stuff has to be out of it before you should apply that to your garden. Green manures, plant leftovers, things like that, a lot of times can be used almost directly. Homegrown compost is your best bet for combining all these needs. Using specialty products like earthworm castings and other amendments, learn and find out what those amendments contribute and then use them appropriately. And using organic fertilizers are a better way because of their slow release than harsher inorganic products. Over-fertilizing can be just as bad as under-fertilizing, and please don't pollute the water. So we recommend using organic methods whenever possible. Crowding in the vegetable garden happens because we can't always be perfect in our seeding. So avoid it. They stress out the plants. But overseeding has some advantages in some places too. If you plant a row of lettuce and pick out smaller heads as the time goes on, guess what? You're improving your thinning, but you're thinning and eating at the same time, and it's kind of a fun way to do that. Overcrowding or overseeding something can also work when you're working with crops that have different maturity dates. So radishes planted over carrots. The radishes are matured and gone before the carrots need that space. So it's an efficient use of space. That comes with experience and information. So let's go on to some of the other things that you have to do with your seedlings. When you pull them out, you don't want to overcrowd them, space them right. Remember, plants are three-dimensional, so however size they grow into, you need to be aware of. The tender seedlings and new transplants are the most vulnerable. So protect them. And one of the best tools you can use for protecting these plants from the elements and from all the pests that might come and eat them up before they have a chance to grow up is a spun cloth called row cloth. So when you plant your seedlings and everything, plan for staking and providing hoops or something to cover, to put the cloth on. And be aware that that can help with heat in terms of keeping the heat in if it's a cold day, or keeping the heat out when it is a very hot day by shading. So garden pests are also, that creates a barrier to birds and garden pests as well. Here's a couple of other ideas for protecting your plants. Always use the materials you have around them. Multi-uses for a single item is wonderful. Some plants need staking, and you can use the staking to support your crops. Some of them that are obvious are pole beans. They do help with better air circulation, increases production, and helps you with fruit quality. It also helps you to harvest more easily, and it can also be an eye catcher, a focal point for your garden. If you want to use them to shade crops that require a little bit of relief from hot afternoon sun, you can do that too. And you can be creative about where things are going. Pruning is a wonderful way to increase and manage your yield, whether it's to get bigger fruit or to get to help separate fruit from and give them more air circulation, keeps leaves off the ground, allows exposure to the sun a little bit more. It's an excellent way to direct the energy of the plant. Now, weeds, the dreaded part here. Well, yes, you have to control the weeds, but if you do it regularly, it's not such a big job, and you can do it at the same time that you're observing for pets and water and things like that. So it all becomes one little swipe through your garden as you're walking along. And Cher just shared this with me. 1 year of seeds will give 10 years of weeds. Well, you're absolutely right. Do not let them flower. Mulching is your best bet for keeping, after controlling your weeds by hand, keep your mulch in your garden. That helps not only conserve moisture, but also helps weed seeds from germinating. And of course, there's your compost again. Compost as mulch, compost as fertilizer. So healthy soil usually if you've put in good soil and you've used good composting, you're going to have fewer weeds. Also beware of new plants that you introduced into your garden, because weeds are very, very efficient hitchhikers. And plant your vegetables as close together as is reasonable to reduce the soil exposure. Then while you're doing the weeding, like we said, you're watching for good and bad bugs. Please encourage the good bugs in your gardens. Flowers for pollinators. Good, healthy plants don't attract unhealthy plants attract bad bugs. Identify what you're seeing. If you're seeing some damage, get to it right away, act upon it. Things change. You have to constantly change. We encourage pesticide-free use of control. And actually, one of our upcoming lectures will be by Tom Schrader, and he'll talk about integrated pest management, which gives you a lot of alternatives to using pesticides, which can be harmful to our good guys as well as to our oceans and groundwater. So please do consider alternatives. And here now we're sitting back and we're saying to ourselves, okay, well, how are we going to do all this stuff? Well, experience is the mother of invention, as they say, but be a good observer of what your garden is doing, whether it's for what's going wrong or what's going right. Try to be aware of all your techniques in terms of their effectiveness. Make sure you're watering the back corner. Don't forget that back corner. Use a tuna can to find out if water's getting back there, something to collect water. Remember the good things like the pollinators. They're all essential. Vegetables have to be pollinated to produce fruit too, except things like corn, which are wind pollinated, but there you need ventilation, correct? Plant what you like, plant what you're going to eat, plant what you're going to work with. Learn from your mistakes, and that is from your journaling. Keep your records, rotate your crops, all the obvious things that go into making a vegetable garden. And so with that, I hope we've given you a basis for getting started. There's no substitution for just doing it and getting started with some basic information and things you've heard. You'll be amazed at how much you've soaked in. Please give it a start. We hope we haven't scared you. And with that, I think Sherida's going to take over. Go ahead, Sherida.
Thank you so much. That was such great information, and hopefully it's been encouraging to some of you, if you haven't already started your vegetable gardens and your own victory garden, to start it. And on our website, we have a lot of information. So please visit our website, and we have a section just on edible gardens. For those of you that still have some questions, please go ahead and type it in your message box, and we're going to get to those messages after a couple of slides. Let me go back to the UC IPM website is www.ipm.ucanr.edu. And I've circled in red the home, garden, turf, and landscape pest. And that's the area that you would enter into. And from there, you would just filter into the section of information that you need. And it's just full of information. And it happens to be our go-to resource when we have questions as well. We're going to be following up this presentation with an email and provide you with some really good resources. We want you to rely on good resources and not some of the stuff that we all Google and find on through Google. Some of that is not reliable science-based information. So we'll be sending out these resources on a follow-up email to you. If you have any questions, on our website, we do have a help desk. And you can pop into the website, fill out a question, and our team of help desk master gardeners will take a look at your questions, and we usually try to respond within 5 days of your question. So please take advantage of that. Okay, so I'm going to get these messages. If I can find my screen tool, will drop down. Get into the chat. So, Maria, our first question is the middle of June too late to start a veggie garden?
No, but your choices might be just slightly more limited. Here on the coast, our spring sort of gets stretched out. And considering our June gloom, you potentially can certainly start some lettuce, probably even some of the other crops. Tomatoes are probably one of your best candidates. All the warm season crops you can start now, because up to this point in time it hasn't been necessarily advantageous for them. But I would certainly start with transplants whenever possible. Things like broccoli and other things might be more difficult. So avoiding the cool season crops, concentrating on the warm season crops might work out. When I was gardening in Seattle, we never really did anything until the end of May and early part of June. So I think you can cheat a little bit and find some things out. Just make sure you understand and look at those planting charts.
Okay, our next question is, I don't have an outdoor space, so I have all the items in pots. Do any of these recommendations change based on that?
Well, this is where you overlap knowledge of growing in containers with your vegetables. Tomatoes do very well in containers. Lettuce can do very well in containers. All the herbs and flowers that you would put in your vegetable gardens. Asparagus and perennials, things like that, are less likely to do well. So make sure that your soil is good. Your watering is going to be more intensive because a pot is a confined environment and can't hold that much water. Make sure that your exposure to sunlight is appropriate. If there's too much shade, your plants won't thrive if they require all that sun. So containers can work very well, but there are certain things that won't work well in them. So a little bit more research or calling up your master gardeners, whatever it takes, we can isolate some of the choices for you. But container gardens can be very successful if you're careful about your choices.
All right, our next question is, could too much nitrogen in my soil be keeping my lemon tree from producing lemons?
It's sometimes hard to imagine too much nitrogen in your soil unless you're doing a lot of fertilizing. So if you're fertilizing a lot and it's skewing your plant towards growing leaves versus fruit, yes. But the lemon tree could be having lots of other different problems in terms of whether or not it's getting enough sun, or it got hit by a cold snap that dropped all its blossoms. I think citrus tends to develop fruit over the winter, if I recall correctly. So I'm not quite sure when lemons are fruiting. If you're seeing any kind of fruit and it's dropping off, then I would consider looking at exposure and disease as being the issues
And
more than anything else.
And I'm going to also add that lemons require a certain amount of phosphorus. And I would recommend
Exactly.
using fertilizers that are strictly for citrus.
And there are, and just as an additional comment, there are a lot of specialty products that help us, whether it's a seedling mix or a citrus fertilizer or a rhododendron fertilizer or a tomato fertilizer. All these things, you can get a lot of information just by walking through your nursery and garden shops and read the labels on everything, especially any product you're going to use. Be sure to read the labels. But yes, fruiting and vegetative growth are two different processes in the plant, and they require different balance of nutrients and water and nitrogen.
Our next question is, my onions don't grow big bulbs. The stalks get big, but when I pull them out, they are almost straight. What am I doing wrong?
How long are they in the ground? If they are not being allowed to mature, then there's no time for bulb formation in the onion bulb. Remember, the onion is a storage part of the root, and so you may be maybe harvesting too soon for it to develop. If you're letting the foliage brown out over time, that's a good indication. There are some varieties of, quote, onions that don't necessarily form bulbs. And is it possible that you've also planted leeks instead? Those tend not to form bulbs. So different, I would double check what you're planting, and then I would double check how long you're allowing them to develop.
And I'm going to add to that, if you plant them too closely and you don't thin, you're not going to get the growth in the bulb as well. So make sure that you plant them at the distance and thin as your seed packets or your onion set instructions say. And I think also on our website, you'll find information on that as well. Okay, our next question is, just pulled garlic from raised bed. What do I need to do to prepare it for planting a lettuce crop?
Actually, not a lot. A bit of compost is probably all you need to add, because garlic and lettuce don't share disease issues, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a good way to be able to plant the lettuce over the garlic. I would say enrich your soil with a bit of compost, moisten it up, and go for it. What about you, Sheridan?
No, I agree. Yeah, I don't think there's much. Just add some compost and go for it. Our next question, I'll go ahead and take this one, is are there any plans to start a new Master Gardener training class for our area in 2020? And yes, there are some plans, but I don't have a date yet. And with COVID protocols, it makes it a little difficult to do any planning right now until we know what we can do in a few months. So we're probably and realistically looking at the latter part of 2021, or perhaps if we still have ongoing confinements with COVID, it might be 2022. But yes, we are definitely going to be offering Master Gardener training class for both Humboldt and the Del Norte counties. And we do have a interest form that you can complete and let us know. And when we have more information, we'll get a hold of you and tell you all of the details. The next question, are there any, let's see, what does it mean when a plant is yellowing at the tips of a leaf?
Well, it depends on the plant, but sometimes that might be an answer that you can reserve for some of our more intensive responses. But if it's all up and down the plant, something is going wrong. And if it's not the obvious things like moisture and over fertilizing, you might want to check around and see if there are any diseases going on that are robbing your roots of absorption of nutrients and things. But yellowing of a leaf is really difficult to diagnose. I'm sorry that I can't give you a better answer for that.
Yeah, our typical answer is it depends, because it does depend on the plant and the situation. So
Exactly.
you'll hear us most commonly say it depends. Let's see, what is the best way to test for soil moisture?
I don't know about you, Sherida, but for me, it's poking my finger in and checking it out. My finger usually will go down 2 inches, and that usually lets me know. You don't want to get to the point where your plant is telling you that there's not enough moisture by it wilting. You want to avoid that. So the first thing you might notice is that the soil is a little bit grayer than usual. That might be the first way to tell. The second thing is to stick that finger in. And the third way is if you really enjoy gadgets and things, there are moisture meters that can help you with that. I personally am not a gadget person, so I don't have one of those that I use. But generally for me, it's the memory of the last time I watered and whether or not my finger finds any moisture in my soil. And sometimes you do have to go in a couple inches, especially if you have a mulch or a compost mulch. So you have to check under that.
Okay, looking for the next one. So how can we tell when our plant has a deficiency in essential nutrients, NPK?
I would say that a deficiency of those macronutrients means the plant is not growing. It's not doing anything. A plant needs to be robust and appropriate for size. And if it doesn't look right, then something's going on. And the best thing you can do with that is check for watering and check and add a little bit of compost and see if the plant responds. If by accident you've not watered that plant, it's not going to thrive. If it's deficient in macronutrients like nitrogen or something like that, it will respond to compost if it hasn't gone over the deep end. But generally, when a plant doesn't look right, something's going on. And if it doesn't respond to watering and compost, then it may be something on in terms of the micronutrients or a pest of some sort. You can check for pests. Remember, pests are not just on the leaves. Sometimes the pests are very tiny and you can't see them. You need to check the stems. You need to check the roots. Sometimes there's something nibbling at the roots that causes a plant to not be able to absorb its nutrients. So these kinds of things are what you check. But basically, if a plant doesn't look right, something's going on. I would not willy-nilly use pesticides or add nutrients, especially the micronutrients, without knowing for sure. So if you've eliminated all the obvious things and you still don't have an answer, sometimes you'll have to test your soil, especially if more than just that plant is affected. So if you're seeing one plant being affected versus a group of plants, that's also a clue to what might be going on. One plant might have a pest. Multiple plants will have conditions that they share: soil, water, nutrient needs.
Okay, unfortunately, we weren't able to get to the rest of the questions, but I promise you we will take these questions and we will do a Q&A posting on our website. And as I mentioned, we'll be sending out a link to that, and you can review the questions and look at the ones that we didn't get to. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we're looking forward for you joining us for our upcoming presentations. And that's going to be on heathers and heaths. Of course, I mentioned the IPM. We're doing a presentation on success with houseplants. And our county director, Yana, will be doing a session on reducing building risk with wildfires. So thank you so much, and I enjoyed our time today and look forward to having you joining us again. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy gardening.